We're joined today by two senior architects who have been pioneers of the profession in the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm pleased to say we're joined by Shirley Bloomberg, who is a founding partner of KPMG Architects and a member of the Order of Canada, and Nille Juel Sorensen, who is the global leader for architecture at Arup and former CEO of the Danish Design Center. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. So first of all, the focus of our conversation today is relevance. What is relevance today at this point in the 21st century? And from your individual perspectives, what have you seen as significant change? And are all of those changes positive and still relevant to the practice of architecture today? Perhaps I could ask you, Shirley, to share your initial thoughts about that.
Love the word relevance. That's what we aspire to, I think, as architects. I think architectural practice has always addressed the issues of our time, and as the world has changed, and that change has been accelerated substantially by the pandemic, so has our practice. So when I studied in the 70s, postmodernism started towards the end of my studies, and then so we had that period, and then we had architecture. So it was fairly bleak in terms of values, and then what is happening now, in my experience, in my entire career, architects have never been as relevant as they are today. And I think all the extraordinary global challenges that we have, like inequity, migration, scarcity of resources, the climate emergency, and now, God help us, AI. And in Canada, truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. All of that has led us to think much, much harder about what we do. And it's certainly not just a question of aesthetics. It's much, much deeper than that. And so we've had to change our practice dramatically to be able to design for resiliency, for zero carbon emissions. And we're seeing already what is happening to the world in terms of climate change. So there's a massive urgency about that. So yes, for us, I think the relevance is huge, and we are committing with our lab to make our focus on sustainability and embodied carbon and net zero, etc., even more intense and actionable. We're in the front lines here as architects, so we need to act now to mitigate what we can in terms of climate emergency. And then, of course, there's the whole issue about inequity, and how do we design architecture, a world that is more inclusive, and how do we decolonize our buildings, etc. So I can go on and on, but there are the interesting things I think now is that the whole profession is much more thoughtful, tackling serious issues that affect people's daily lives.
Thank you, Shirley. Nille, how have you been thinking about relevance and your sharp perspective from also working on many projects globally?
Yeah, so I think Shirley is absolutely right. The relevance of architects and architecture, is so high right now, because the world has been, it's more and more complex. You could say it was simpler when I started 40 years ago, but maybe it's because I can't remember that it maybe was complex. It was just a different kind of complexity, but it was probably the same. But I think when I look back, I think that, the architecture I've always been involved in have been very, very social. It's all about people. And and the size of a person has changed a little bit. We're going a little bit more, wider, the same, a little bit more taller, but we are basically the same size all over the world, so there's this human scale that I always design from. And then I think that coming from a country that has always had scarcity and resources, we just have pigs and we have water, so we have fish, but we don't have oil, we don't have anything, and it's a farming country, so it's always been a modest country. So we always design to think how you use materials. So that has sort of been, in the DNA of how we brought up. But then I think when we got to the 80s and the 90s, everything went wild in a way. And it was, and we got tools that could, now we could design things that we never thought about that we could design. And now I see that we actually coming back to what I call basic. How can we actually design less? The best thing is not to build anything, but we need to build something because there's still, people need flats, we need all kinds of things. But so that means that we are back to basics. How simple can we make it? How can we actually see our architecture as outcomes? And I think for a long time we've been looking at outputs. So that's why we have, star architects. And I think there will always be star architects. There will always be these architects who do, wild and shapy forms, whatever, fine. But I think what is really needed is the outcome. So that means that I can see that before I was very interested in aesthetics. I don't think much about that. I think about, as Shirley's also saying, that, there is this thing about carbon. There is this thing about the weather's changing. The whole climate is just, going wild. So we need to design in a different way. And I also think that for the last 2-3 years, I've been thinking about what is the aesthetics of the new era. Because we have to leave our bags. We have to leave everything we learned about aesthetics and say, okay, but, what is it? What is the design tools of the future? How are we going to build things? How are we going to produce them? How are we going to maintain them? And all these things has a lot higher value. And what is it for spaces we do? And I think sometimes, because I travel a lot, I see a lot of architecture, and sometimes I think, why? Why is that building here? It don't belong. There's no wow. That there's a shape making, which it could be interest, depends on the eyes who see it. Right? But there's nothing where you think, okay, this belongs. This has an output. And sometimes you see buildings that is basically ugly compared to my sort of old school aesthetics, but they are an outcome. They start something in the city. They are inclusive. They are everything. And that means that then I'm really happy. And then I can see that we are going in the right direction. It's just going too slow. But, that's how the world is. But I see that the complexity we are in now is enormous. And I think architects should put themselves as the conductor of the orchestra. That's how I see us. We have a whole symphony orchestra of 100 God knows many musicians that you have to conduct, and you are the one who are not the author of the project, the one who's leading to that. And I think during COVID, it was a lot about on screens, and I think we got closer together. In Arab, because we were global, but then we were meeting. Everyone was at the same meeting, which was fantastic. But it's like when you play jazz music, you cannot dub everyone. You have to be present, because if you want to do innovation, or you want to jam, or you want to, do improvisation, you need to be there. And I can see we're getting back to that in some sorts. And when we have done the tune, then you can fine tune it over whatever means we have of digital source.
How do you think about architecture now that we're moving forward into this era of technology? Do you think that the quality of architecture has gotten better? Has the quality of life gotten better? or is it been very slow to advance, or has it regressed?
I think that it's very difficult to judge your own time because there's a lot about fashion. Yeah, how we like that this year, but I was very interested in Venturi, and I think Venturists are thinking I still like that, but some of the outcomes that came out of the postmodernism don't have any interest in any longer. But what I see is that now we have all the tools. We have amazing tools. We can spin models. We can do whatever we can do. Parametric design. We are using a lot of AI. I love it. I think it's fantastic. It is just another bucket we have to learn to deal with. What I'm missing is that the young people in my office, they lost the 3-dimension. They lost this feeling for space. What is a space? Why is it a nice space? What is it, the lighting? So now we have all these tools, and we spend an awful lot of time on tools. But when do we actually sit down and just sort of, what is this? What is it for kind of space I'm looking for, right? And I think cardboard models, have gone. Everything is in the cloud or something like that. How do we get back to talking about space for people? And that's not about technology. Technology is just the enabler to do whatever you do. But I still think the thinking, the feeling, that's human. That's,
Yes.
Yeah,
Sure,
I think,
please jump right in.
it's a great, fascinating question. I agree with what was just said. And, Marshall McLuhan, our famous Canadian, said something to the effect that when technology moves on, the previous technology is even more valued. So, as Nili says, we have all these tools and but our thinking process is still the same. I know we have AI, but in the end, maybe it's great for looking at kind of master plans and giving you options, but in the end, who brings AI doesn't bring humanity to it, doesn't bring generosity, doesn't give people choice. So I still believe that architecture in that way is still very old-fashioned. You still have to think it through to design it. And I think because we've got all these tools, sketches are even more essential. Because before you plunge into the computer, you have to have an idea of what you want to explore. And to get the big idea, you have to sketch. And I find, Nili, you probably find as well that young people don't draw by hand anymore. And that's a real loss and a problem, I think. And I also find they don't, as they're designing, imagine themselves in the spaces they're drawing, which is a massive problem because that's what we do, right?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. It's that thing that it's 3-dimensional in the drawing is there very fast, but
yeah, it's too fast.
Yes, but they can't imagine. So I have to say that I work with a lot of young people who sketch on computers in clay and knows what, and I don't care as long as we can sit around a table and talk about it and talk about, as you say, what is this kind of space, right? So sometimes I ask them to, can you just give me a section? And
exactly. Yeah.
Both ways. And then I can imagine that space, right? And of course, then I can dive into a 3D model or whatever. But I'm saying that there has to be some kind of simplicity in the section.
Correct. Exactly. And the section's very telling to a design. So then the plan almost. Right?
I will not change that, but maybe they could do something else for me, right? That I don't have to draw the same.
You might be heartened, Nili, that we still make cardboard and wood models and working models because we do both. We do everything. And the computer's too far. It gives everyone a false sense of security, and it doesn't invite kind of probing thoughts about the space. It looks great, but takes a lot more than that to make a good piece of architecture.
And I also think that and that's probably what happened, is because I see a trend now going the other way. But there's all these renders, right? And we were doing a competition for a huge airport in China, and I think it was like 2 a.m. we went to the renders office, and trying to tell them that what we wanted. But then he said, "What style do you want?" So they actually had a filter.
Oh dear! Oh dear!
I did, or and I was just like,
that's depressing. It's been commodified, right?
Yes, and because you can do that now. That means that I see there's I can't remember what they call it, a Belgium office that's almost back to the collage.
Yes.
I really like it because it and it's telling.
But at least collages were kind of had to think a little more and put them together, right?
And in a collage you have the narrative.
Yes.
And I think and I think for architects, so if we look back, due to all the stuff we can do now, sometimes we lose the narrative. Why are we actually doing this, right? And what is the story? And
yes. And if you don't have that, the building has no soul.
Exactly. And you'll be criticized. And I'm always saying that when you have that narrative, you have the idea, the vision. From that moment, it goes downhill. But
yeah, this is true. But you know what? I don't know if this is your experience, but not to sound too kind of, Pollyanna about it, but I swear every time we do value engineering, the building gets better because that editing process makes you really think about what's really important in this building, So I find that kind of fascinating. I'd like to come back to what you said before about, because I've been thinking about too, the aesthetics of the future, given a passive house, given low carbon, zero carbon, and also ethical sourcing of materials, all of that, right? And I think we're in an age where, firstly, we have to really listen to the people who are going to use our buildings. If we're going to solve the problem, it's really straightforward. Architecture is still about solving a problem. But to solve that problem, we have to really listen and understand the problem. And I think too often that, the community or the users are dismissed. So I'm glad to see that change. And I think also when it comes to the aesthetics, it's with limited resources and lack of affordable housing is overwhelming globally, et cetera, et cetera. I think the buildings have to take on a bit more modesty, be a little more humble. And it seems to me that if we're going to design for zero carbon, then the materials are going to be more minimal in expression, because what you said is incredibly important. The most sustainable thing to do is not to build, right? But if you have to build for hundreds of years, so you don't have to expend energy and embodied carbon, et cetera, flexible, adaptable buildings like the old loft warehouses. We knew how to do this. We just lost touch with all of it since the Second World War, it seems. And a kind of a simpler, more direct aesthetic, and if it's less embellished by a certain kind of predominant culture, perhaps it might be more inclusive for people. Perhaps people of different backgrounds could feel a sense of belonging. Those are the kind of things that I'm very interested in now.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think you're right. We just won a new metro line in Copenhagen. It's the third time I do, so I've done them all.
Wow.
And this time, it's a fantastic client, I have to say, with a vision led by an architect, maybe, and that's why. As she stepped down now, she's 80, taken over by a new team. And they told us, you have to reduce carbon by 50% compared to the last one.
Love it. That's fantastic.
And when you think about, these are underground stations.
Oh my God.
So
that's not easy.
There's a few above ground, and we can do those in timber. But I think, in the beginning, everybody said, we can't do that. And then we said, we don't know how to do it, but let's start and find out, are we sure that, when we do a wall, that we just take it's 20 centimeters of concrete, I don't want to calculate it any longer, right? So we have to recalculate everything.
Yes,
really
good.
Think about
Exactly.
it.
Yeah.
How do we use the mock? And I can see that the young architects, the young engineers, you can see that fire. Wow, this is not, the old school way of doing it. Now we have it. And I think these projects where you have a team that feels that there is there's an outcome, there's a reach, there's all these things. And there was one of the young, I think she was sustainability. She said, wouldn't it be fantastic that every time I took the metro, I felt that I was, a part of something bigger, actually saving the world.
Great statement. That's so great.
I had my clinics up.
Yes.
That is how we should feel about our buildings.
Yes,
it's
100%.
Isn't it that we want to ensure that our humanity is still relevant, that the human presence is still relevant in our world?
Yeah, and also I think that sometimes we do buildings which are very rigid for financial reasons, or planning reasons, or God knows what. There's so many reasons, and that means that when time changes, you cannot change the building. It's difficult. But when you look at all the Georgian houses in London, all the the houses in Toronto, houses here in Denmark that was built in 1800 and God knows what.
Yeah.
They have been capable of adapting to, from no electricity, no toilets, to having it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, I was walking in Manhattan, and they changed all these office buildings into, I think they call them young professional apartments. But it was a shoebox, and it's okay to live in a shoebox if it's if it has a quality. But there was no quality here, right? And I think so we also have to think about that maybe when we build, we shouldn't build everything, but we should, maybe the new aesthetic is that you have the right to 100 square meters, but we'll just build the 40 square meters for you now because you're single or you're just a couple. And then you can just continue building. And I think that giving that freedom away is a tough thing when I talk to architects. But on the other hand, if you make it right, if you give them the tools, if people will actually normally act quite good, and the aesthetics will be okay, it will be different, and we have to live with that because and the circular thing that I like that people here, they are completely into it, right?
Yes, and we are too. No, I absolutely love that idea, and I think the pendulum has swung away from architects as design police and dictators to designing with generosity and giving people freedom and choice. And if you think about it, all we do in architecture, it's the framework for people's lives.
Yeah,
but the people's lives are important, and you have to give them that choice. And so I think that's the part of kind of modesty and be humble, and also preserving buildings. I think if you look at all the recent Pritzker Prize winners, it's incredibly impressive.
Yeah,
I think, and that direction is wonderful.
Yeah, and I also think that sometimes architects, and you and I, sometimes we get a little bit grumpy. Oh, it was better, when we were young, and that was more, fees were better, there's more quality. And I don't think so. And sometimes, that's why I like to work with young people, because they always push me and say, "What are you talking about? I don't know what."
Yes.
Right. But that means you have to explain things in a new way, in a new context, and suddenly you find out that there's things that you don't need to mention because that is ridiculous. But there's things that we learned that has, you said it, was forgotten after the Second World War, that is now coming back.
Yeah.
I think, I think there is enormous bright future out there, and I think there's, there is this, to me, we've never had a better chance to change thing or help conduct the change.
Yes.
And that means that and there's all kind of things. We do industrial buildings, we do power to X buildings, we do God knows what. But how do you give that quality? And I think that's, as you say, we have to do the sort of the canvas and the backdrop so people can live their life. It's not mine. It's not whoever is paying for it.
Well, I think that's so true. I think as architects, we're citizens first.
Yeah.
Our responsibility is to the public, to the people who use our buildings, and to the clients second. Yeah. We can't tell that to the clients, but we really have to. So I actually think this is the most exhilarating period of time to be an architect, because we have, after all these decades of specialization, we've always been people who synthesize and solve problems that way. And those are the skills that are needed right now to solve these very complex problems. So the change has been overwhelming, but like you, I have so much faith in the younger generation. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And
I also think that, I went to Auckland because we won Metro in Auckland, and there was a day with the client, and they said, you have to come because you have to join that. And I said, okay, so what is it? They said, we have to meet the client. And I thought, okay, this is an own client meeting. No, so this was the Maoris. And so they started, telling us about the people, where they came from. You were just, you were a split in that 1,000-year of evolution of, the Maori. So, and you have to remember, you stand on the shoulders of others.
Exactly. Yeah.
And others will stand on your shoulders. And that was, I was thinking, wow, this is, everything I've been, sort of thinking about. And then we had a whole day where we were planting things. We were in the fields. We were, because that's where we were going to build some of the metro stations. And then we talked to them. And when we were driving back, I said to our director in our Auckland office, wow, where do I find, a book, something that, I can learn about this? And she was laughing, saying there's been a few books that someone has tried to explain it, but you have to, you have to live it.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe, sometimes with the international work that I'm sketching on a station in Auckland, if I don't go to Auckland, if I don't talk to the Maoris, if I don't try to understand how they see things, how should I, why, how can I come in and say, I think this is good for you? I haven't got a clue.
Exactly. And it's true of all the wisdom cultures. They are oral, right?
Yeah.
And in Canada, it's also a very exciting moment because we have a terrible history with First Nations and of repression and the residential schools, trying to change them to be acculturated into the mainstream kind of colonial white society. Essentially a kind of, eradication of their culture. So I was born and raised in South Africa, and I was shocked to find out, because I also saw Canada as a very open country. It is today, but it hadn't always been. And the South African system of apartheid, when they were setting that up after the war, they actually came to look at the Canadian reservations. So that was kind of shocking. So what I did is I started doing research and reading up about it and working with an Indigenous architect and actually a young American here in the office. So we had a South African and a young American doing all this research on Indigenous culture. And there's a massive housing problem in the north, and the conditions are awful, very complicated. And so I roped in friendly engineers, environmental, building envelope, et cetera, to try and figure out the principles of how you could actually build effectively and also consult and build what the community really, really wants and needs. And then we had an opportunity in the furthest most northmost community in Ontario, a little place called Fort Severn on Lake Huron. And we did this with Brian Porter from Truro, who is the Indigenous architect that I've worked with most. And we designed a duplex that they needed. The young American went up there with Brian, spent 3 or 4 days, figured out exactly what was needed and so on. And we did it all in accordance with Indigenous ways of knowing, which is the way we used to design before the war, right? In accordance with the force of nature and so on, old days. But incorporating all the values and so on. So that was pretty extraordinary. And the project actually won Social Equity Award at WAFX that year. So those experiences have changed the way we practice, because pretty well every project involves indigeneity in some form or other, and it's respecting, like your story about the Maoris, of going back 15,000 years and the culture that was here, and what we learned from that culture and so on. So that's been a kind of fascinating thing that's over the last decade or more has become very prevalent in our practice.
It's so reassuring to hear both of you talk about how connected we need to stay to our world today, who we are as a human race, and to be really thinking about those values of the environment that have enabled us to exist across the centuries. And how do we ensure that that's still part of our thinking as we design our today's environments and our near future environments?
I think the coolest thing is that all the technology I have around me, I love it. I can talk to you, I can talk to Shirley, I can see you, I can see my grandchild or whatever, and I have decided that is just my helpers. I want to have more time to think.
Exactly.
Yes.
Sometimes you're overwhelmed by technology. Oh, now you can do 3D, you can blow it up and you can turn it around. So we spend a lot of time on things, right? And I say, probably fair enough, it's fun for a 25-year-old, I don't know. But to me, I just think it's fantastic that I actually have more time to sketch. And also because spreadsheet is not my best friend. So I have people doing that. So I learned that you cannot control everything. So you find out what is it you can control. And I'm saying I can control my pen, my thinking, and the mentoring of young people, and also the reverse mentoring. So I have that. I have a young person who is teaching me how life is on Earth these days. but to me, I mean, there's a lot of people who are very negative about the whole digital that is coming, is here, and all these things. And yes, there is a lot of problems. I don't think there's something about moral issues and all these things that we have to deal with. But on the other hand, it's helping me a lot. It's actually helping me to find out that before I arrive in a city, I can actually walk the streets. I can get sort of a feeling. That is, I remember when we were moving to Canada, there's someone who actually recorded, from the one end of Yonge Street to the other end. 5 minutes of video, right? But it teaches you a lot about Toronto, right? That you have this peak in the middle and then it's flat and it just continues for, it's like stop. But I think that's technology helping me. So then I have to think and I have to feel, I have to smell, these things to get my technology to do what I wanted to do.
Yeah, and don't you think, Nina, it was remarkable that we were able to work through the pandemic? That was extraordinary, right?
Yes, and I think we were actually very effective.
We were. Everybody pivoted.
Yeah,
it was frustrating a little, but it was amazing. Yeah.
I also think there was a lot of people who burned out because they couldn't figure out when are you working, when you're not working. So what we did was we had sort of a monthly call, because we have offices all over the world, and I have to coordinate these 400 people and what we do. But what happened was that we realized that, we were sitting around the same table. But you were placed in Toronto, I was in Copenhagen, and we had meetings, we could sketch. I think the sketch thing, is not there, But
it's a little tough, to mentor. Yeah.
That meant from being, a series of offices, then we were one office.
Yeah.
And we could coordinate, and I could work on your jobs, and and what we called it a digital long-term or short-term contract. So that meant that if you are living in Copenhagen working on a project in Asia, you just changed your life into their time zone. So you were whatever,
Yeah.
So it has these amazing things, and I think suddenly, there was a lot of things that before, Skype was not very good, nothing was very good, and suddenly Zoom came, Teams, everything just boom came out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
So you can't say
that we didn't see that coming.
No,
we didn't, did we?
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you, from our conversation today, I'm hearing such strong themes about humanity, about generosity, freedom, choice, keeping an open mind, staying connected across generations to knowledge that's there, and how we bring that forward into the built environment professions. Do you have any final thoughts to share with us today? I'm fairly certain we might be having another conversation with both of you because there's so much ground that we've covered. For today, any final thoughts about relevance today in the 21st century for architecture?
I think that everyone who's practicing architecture of whatever kind it is have to sit down and think, this is not for me. It's for someone else, whatever I do. And that means that it's not my personal, whatever. I have to listen. And then what is your moral compass? And I have found out that, the moral issues are the same no matter where you are living. Don't kill people. That's not the human thing. So there is these things. You don't cheat. There's all these things that is the same. And if we can keep that high moral, and also, it's a rich world, and we just decided not to put it out evenly in the world. How can we help people in need and understand their needs and not what we think they need? And I think that has been quite a problem when I see housing in some, deprived areas. You think, well, why are we giving in that? They don't, we have done buildings in Greenland that is, made for Danes, but people on Greenland live a completely different life because we didn't bother to think about it. And I think these things are the things we have to focus on. And then we will build something around it, and that will be probably wonderful.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, Nile, and I completely agree. I do a fair amount of social housing, and the first building I built was all social housing, and it was in a sea of condos down near the waterfront here, and I wanted it to be more beautiful, more attractive than any of the condos, which wasn't a very high bar. And ironically, social housing standards of space are more generous because it's under the Toronto Community Housing umbrella than the market, which became these tiny little apartments sold to people overseas, foreign investors. And my moment, which was quite wonderful, was most exciting moment. The building, there were two. The building was up, and you could see the facade already, and so on. And they always teamed Toronto Community Housing with a developer, and the developer was getting calls about the luxury condominium units they were building, and they'd have to say, sorry, it's social housing. So that was fun. I think to me it's much more. And then my project architect, when he was doing the deficiencies and so on, came back to me and said, he had things like people who moved in there saying, this building has changed my life. Like, what could be better than working on something like that? So I think if it was, I think Thoreau who said, to affect the quality of the day, that's the kind of highest art of all. And we have that opportunity, plus to address very, very grave issues that are threatening our lives on the planet. So I think it's an extraordinarily interesting time.
It is.
Right.
Well,
and we're optimistic, right?
Absolutely.
optimism is our way forward.
Yes.
Yes. I'd like to thank both of you, Shirley and Nile, for joining us today. It's been a very inspiring conversation. And through that perspective on relevance, you're giving us further hope for the future of the 21st century and humanity. Thank you both so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to meet you.